At 0214 UTC, the red world is a steady coin, and far beyond it, a faint green halo lingers like a held breath. The room is dim, the kind of dim that lets your eyes soften, and I'm here beside you, quiet voice, easy pace, so you can drift while we unspool a gentle story from a very large sky. If it's safe to do so, set your phone to Do Not Disturb, lower the lights, maybe put on headphones, so small sounds feel close but never sharp. Breathe with me, slow in, slower out. We'll keep the sentences calm, the steps small, and the science kindly explained so your mind has soft places to land. Tonight, I'll guide you through a near pass between worlds, probability that behaves like weather, and chemistry that prefers patience to spectacle. No rushing, no verdicts, just a measured walk. Distance first, then water waking in the cold, then quiet builders that carry energy along tidy paths, and the instruments that listen without blinking. Somewhere between those pieces, you'll find the place where sleep can take over. If you'd like, you can tell me tomorrow where you're listening from and what time night reaches you. For now, you can simply settle. If this helps you rest, add it to your Sleepy Science playlist so the next night arrives without searching. I'll keep the light low and the cadence even. The green thins toward a pale blue, almost a lullaby. Let your gaze ease across a dim canvas of space. First, the steady ember of Mars, small and certain, holding its color like a bedside lamp behind gauze. Then, a little farther out, where the black feels softer. A faint green lifts from the dark, like a film of light you can almost touch. I stay with you there, moving slowly, so your thoughts don't need to hurry to catch up. Follow the glow as it rounds the planet's path and keeps going. It doesn't curve toward home the way most wanderers do. It passes through the neighborhood once, a straight reading on the page rather than a loop in the margin. I keep my voice low while we trace the line, letting the picture do the work of explanation, the way a dim hallway tells you where to walk by, the way it brightens at the end. Between the red world and that pale halo, there is distance that is both gentle and grand. Gentle, because nothing here is in danger. Grand, because even a safe gap is a cathedral when measured in space. I hold the two truths at once and let them sit, the way a nightlight holds both shadow and comfort together. If the eye lingers, it finds patience in the light itself. The coma around the visitor isn't loud. It swells and loosens like breath against a window, an almost color that comes and goes as if remembering its own shape. In that hush, we allow simple framing to guide us. A one-time path through the sun's field, a quiet brush with a nearby world, and then the long outward glide again. We could go straight to mechanisms, to the chemistry that brightens a halo and the grains that carry it. But there's value in a measured first pass. Picture a pencil ray cutting across a dimmed dome, the tip lit, the shaft nearly invisible. That is close enough to the truth for now. Your shoulders can decide they do not need to hold anything tight. The mind, when it knows the scale is kind, relaxes into curiosity. It asks softer questions. How do we sense a visitor so far from our hands? What tells us it comes from beyond, and what tells us it will not stay? Answers arrive like small reflections, motion that doesn't close into an orbit, a speed that belongs to a longer story than the sun can bind, a sheet of light aligned with the familiar plane where planets move like careful lanterns in a row. As that green halo steadies, I place 3 quiet handrails for the hours ahead. Distance, path, and patience. Distance, because the mind sleeps better when it knows the room is spacious. Path, because a single pass carries a different kind of meaning than a circle ever can. Patience, because the light you see is slow work made visible, not a spectacle, but a process with its own unhurried pulse. Hold with me on that last thought. Light is a record, and in astronomy, we read it with the same care a librarian gives to old paper. Color tells us about atoms excited by sunlight. Brightness tells us about dust and ice, and the way a glow grows tells us about heat, working its way inward over weeks and months, each day loosening a little more of what the visitor can offer to empty space without ever reaching for drama. From Mars's perspective, this was an evening show at the edge of its sky, the brightest point still just a soft bead to the instruments nearby. From ours, it was a reminder that events can be remarkable and safe at the same time. We are allowed to be curious without being alarmed, to look closely without assigning intention, to let coincidence and the mechanics share the stage until evidence asks us to choose. There is another anchor that helps the mind rest. The visitor's nearest swing around the sun comes and goes, while our side of Earth looks into daylight. And for a short season, the glare hides the scene from backyard mirrors and rooftop domes. That delay is a kindness to a sleepy brain. Nothing urgent to watch, no need to track a brightening every night, just a promise that instruments across the solar system are listening, and that they will speak in due time. Still, the image that matters for sleep is simple. Mars holds steady like a low lamp. Far beyond it, a visitor writes a thin line of light across the dark room and keeps going. Between them, space draws a quiet margin where nothing touches and everything is noticed. If you close your eyes, you can keep that small geometry and let the rest fade to comfortable blur. We'll peel layers gently in the next hours. The waking of water in deep cold, the pale chemistry that builds from simple parts, the way charged light traces paths across invisible fields. But not yet. For now, I keep you with the picture we began with, a soft focus scene where scale and safety share the same frame, and a halo that seems to breathe around a point that will not stay. The green eases toward cooler blue as the night adjusts, and the room exhale matches it. The room keeps an easy hush, and the instrument gives me time in sound. 1 tick for each measurement, 1 breath for each line of ephemeris it reads out in a soft electronic whisper. A slow metronome steadies the night, and I match it, letting thoughts arrive only on the beat. On this rhythm, probability becomes something you can hear. The cursor moves, the mount hums, and a faint chime notes when 2 paths draw near without touching. That nearness has a name, closest approach between orbits, a measured gap that belongs to geometry more than to drama. The device doesn't care for adjectives. It marks the interval, saves the value, and waits for the next tick. Now the metronome leans into plane and angle. Most visitors swing in at a slant, their pitches high or low against the quiet chord where our planets travel. This one rides closer to that chord than most, which feels orderly to the ear, like 2 notes that happen to share a scale. Alignment is not certainty. It is simply a pattern the device can log without comment. Another beat, the solution updates. The curve is not a loop, but an open arc, a one-time pass that won't be caught. The instrument does not invent reasons. It knows that a path like this is set by where an object came from, and how the sun and planets tug as it goes by. It hears the story in velocity more than in intention, and so do I. When the ticks line up across a page of nights, chance begins to stack in a way that feels like a drum taught to count. A near pass to Mars on one line, a path that keeps to the crowded plane on another, a speed that says once and then away on a third. Each by itself is ordinary enough. Together, they sound unusual, not because a conductor is waving a baton, but because sometimes the random walk writes a tidy bar of music before it dissolves again. The safest rule in a room like this is that inference must move more slowly than noise. The spectre of purpose is a loud instrument. It wants to rush the tempo, to turn a chance cadence into a chorus. I listen for the quieter lesson the device keeps offering, the same one it has offered on every patient night with comets and asteroids. Patterns are invitations to measure again, not verdicts to carve in stone. It helps to keep a few definitions close by, not as weapons, but as tuning forks. A closest approach between orbits is a geometric minimum. The worlds themselves still have to be there at the same time to make anything of it, and most of the time they are not, which is why space is mostly distance and waiting, even when the numbers look tight to the eye. A low tilt toward the planetary plane is uncommon but not rare. A one-way arc is expected for guests from beyond. And if two of these features appear in the same score, the right response is neither applause nor alarm, but another careful count, taken on a calmer night when the air is steady, and the clock keeps its modest, kindly tempo through the dark. Probability lives in ratios, but you don't need the figures in your lap to rest with the idea. It is enough to let the soundscape hold it. This tick for the fraction that says aligned, the next for the fraction that says not here on the same day, the next for the fraction that says boundless path, and the next for no steering necessary. Because in the end, the comfort comes from knowing that long strings of chance are possible without anyone leaning on the keys, and that the machine will keep counting them as faithfully as ever. All of this prepares the ear for a different register that's coming, the soft hiss of chemistry overlaid on orbital rhythm. Spectra do not tick. They sing in straight lines that appear where atoms answer sunlight, and our patient metronome will give way, for a while, to a steady band where water and other simple voices make themselves known. Before we step there, we let the calibrator do its last quiet sweep. It is a gentle reminder that one set of patterns, the paths, hands off to another, the light, without argument. I leave you with the instrument's final cue for this chapter, just a small sound in the dim. A relay settles, the fan breathes, and the counter registers the next silence the way a drummer counts a rest. The spectrograph ticks once. What does water do this far from the sun? It begins a small journey, not a sprint, not even a walk at first, more like a traveller unzipping a bag, checking a map, and waiting for dawn. Ice near the surface feels a little warmth, then a little more, and some portion of it chooses the road from solid to gas. The first miles are quiet. How do we know it is set out? We don't watch the molecule itself, we follow its waypoints. when sunlight breaks water into a companion called OH, the light it gives off becomes a signpost we can read, a discrete mile marker on a long route through the coma. Instruments collect those markers like stamps in a passport, and slowly the itinerary appears. Does that mean the whole nucleus is steaming? Not usually, not out here. Think of scattered caravans rather than a crowded highway. Patches warm unevenly, and grains of ice can be lofted into space where their trip continues more easily than it would on the ground. Free of the surface, a grain turns its face to the sun and moves through the stages of the journey faster, like a traveller who has finally found the right train. Is the distance to the sun a hard border for this process? It is more like a series of gates on a road. Far out, only the most volatile ices regularly choose to travel. Water is cautious, waiting for the next checkpoint where the temperature makes departure comfortable. Yet, with some help from the lofted grains, and with sunlight banking its small daily deposits, water starts to join the route even before the usual threshold, adding a few more footsteps to the tally each day. How much movement are we really talking about? Enough to trace a steady path without crowding the lanes. For the mind at rest, it is kinder to think of dozens of kilograms each second as a pace, rather than a headline, because the feeling matters more than the figure here. A reliable flow, not a flood, a procession of travellers leaving in small groups and spreading out into space where the road is wide. What carries them once they have left home? The faint push of sunlight, the gentle tug of the nucleus, and the constant pull of the sun combine into a route plan that looks simple from far away and intricate up close. In that plan, water begins as the medium for many other passengers, dust and salts and tiny organics, yet it keeps its own schedule, dissociating, reforming, and marking the path as it goes. Is there a reason to bring Mars onto this map now, only to place a compass rose on the chart? The planet sits along a line the traveller crosses, not a destination, not a rendezvous, just a point that helps us orient the story. The track is long, and most of what leaves the nucleus walks right past any world without ever pausing, the way a night train passes through a station where the platform lights are on, but no one boards. What about the days and nights of this journey? In astronomy, we count them differently, but your body knows the rhythm all the same. The pace increases when sunlight strengthens, eases when the angle widens, and the totals add like footsteps on a pedometer, unremarkable in any given hour and surprisingly long when the week ends. In that sense, the coma becomes a slow parade, and every molecule that joins it takes a number and falls in line without fuss. Could there be hidden shortcuts? There are always side paths. Fractures that open and expose fresh ice, grains whose spin presents more surface to the sun, pockets where darker dust warms the neighbourhood and lowers the barrier to motion. Each shortcut is local and temporary, and over time they average into something that looks like a main road, which is why we trust the large pattern more than any single flourish of activity. And the mechanism itself, what should we hold on to? If the word sublimation feels technical, replace it with departure, because that is the shape of it. A molecule held in a crystal lattice decides to travel. It steps out without melting. It joins a thin stream that thickens as companions. Make the same choice. Sunlight remains the quiet patron that funds the trip, and the coma becomes the marketplace where travelers mingle, before the solar wind encourages them onward, away from home and into interplanetary routes where they'll be thinned to almost nothing, and still the ledger shows that they went, and that the going meant heat had worked its way inward, and that an object from afar had begun to change in a way we can read. If you picture that ledger, you can also picture the comfort inside it. Nothing here asks for urgency. The itinerary unfolds on its own, and instruments keep the log even when we sleep. Somewhere in the balance of these pages there is a line that will matter later, when other chemistry steps onto the road and finds that water has already drawn a path, and the mind taking in this story can rest, because the road is clear and the travellers are calm, and every waypoint is spaced far enough apart that there is no crowding as night deepens around the tail. So what comes next on the route? After water has shown us the way, other small builders begin to walk their sections, some carrying energy in easy packets, some carrying carbon in forms that prefer to meet near warmth, some wearing the quiet usefulness of metals, like a key on a lanyard. They will not rush. They will follow, as travellers do, the path that is already traced in front of them by the simplest, most patient mover we know. If the stream keeps to this pace, where does it rest next? Postcard in time, a bench light over glassware, the lab windows dark, the clock with its thin second hand pausing at 03:18, as if it, too, were listening. In this small, still frame, cyanide lies on the table like a fabric with two faces. One face is harsh, threads that catch on breath and stop the weave in living cells. The other face is unexpectedly soft, a pattern that, under the right warmth and light, helps stitch simple carbon pieces into longer cloth. I keep my voice low while we turn the swatch. In bodies, cyanide binds at a critical metal seat where oxygen should rest, a snag that unravels energy flow. The image is tidy and enough. We do not linger with fear. We turn the cloth again and find an older story, one that belongs to patient glass, gentle heat, and the quiet willingness of simple ingredients to link. On that bench, mid-century minds pass tiny storms of spark through a sealed world, and then, days later, read the stain of new compounds on paper like a loom's first test strip. The lesson wasn't that life had appeared, only that the yarns of life are willing to form if the room is set with care. Cyanide, present among those gases, played both villain and helper, a rare co-star that can steal breath from a finished garment and yet help twist the first threads before any breathing is possible at all. Later postcards arrived from other benches. Careful work showing how cyanide, when paired with light and the simplest companions, can hand electrons along tidy paths, a shuttle moving back and forth so the weave can grow. In these scenes, the chemistry looks unhurried, the kind of progress that rewards repetition and accepts that the cloth might need to be unpicked and tried again before the pattern holds. Out beyond the windows, a visitor glows where the sun's warmth reaches a little deeper each day. Cyanide's sign in that glow is a colour and a set of fine lines that strengthen as distance shrinks, as if the bolt of fabric were being drawn across the loom faster than before. Steepness matters here, not for drama, but because it tells us how much warmth is needed before threads really start to run, and which parts of the bolt wake first when the shuttle moves. There is no need to declare the pattern perfect. Kome are messy workshops. Material breaks, recombines, and drafts back into the room. Fragments float like loose fibers and catch on whatever passes. What holds attention is that cyanide is present, and present in a way that suggests the warp is engaged, the strands paying out into the air where light can read them, and instruments can note the rhythm without raising their voices. Cyanide does something else in a basin of water with a little base and time. It polymerizes, a quiet self-thickening that leaves a dark film the way dye sets into cloth. Hidden in that film, analysis finds familiar motifs, rings that echo letters in the alphabet of genes, small acids that later find their way into proteins. The film isn't life. It's a swatch book, proof that threads can be spun from simple feedstock before any loom is built. All of this makes the cold of Mars feel like a conserver's cabinet. The planet keeps long winters, thin air, and sheltered pockets where ice persists. In such storage, cyanide can sit without rushing, folded into frost or dust for longer than a human century. Nothing about that is a promise, only a condition that favors keeping the threads intact until warmth or work invites them out again. The mind rests more easily when the fabric metaphor stays honest. Cyanide on a bench is a reagent, not a destiny. Cyanide in a coma is a tracer of processes, not a verdict. Cyanide in a polar shadow is a stored bolt that may never see use. And yet, when you place these pieces end to end, the bench, the glow, the cabinet, you can feel why a patient scientist's hand reaches for a magnifier rather than an exclamation, because the texture is interesting, and the weave has precedent. And precedent is often the gentlest path to understanding in a night designed for sleep. I leave one narrow hem unfinished on purpose, a seam that will match the next fabric we examine. Some metal centers, nickel among them, serve as pins and shuttles in old enzymes, giving certain looms the strength to move. If those pins are present where the cloth is trying to form, the first rows can sometimes settle faster, the way a warp straightens when you fix it to a proper frame and let the shuttle travel smooth. At 03:18, the clock's hand moves and we set the next card on the table. The room hums at a low idle, fans breathing in an even loop while the spectrograph clicks softly, not impatient, just present. In the headphones, the noise floor is a pale wash, and under it, a cool metallic hush holds steady like mist pooled over a quiet lake before dawn. I keep still with you, and let that hush set the pace. Spectra arrive as thin bands where the glow is combed into lines. Each line is a condensation, a neat edge forming out of the luminous haze, the way a track appears when fog thins along a fence. We read the spacing and brightness, and we learn what atoms are answering the sun. It is a gentle craft, this business of seeing through mist to find structure without tearing it. Tonight's quiet puzzle sits in those bands. A set of nickel lines stands up clean in the blue and near UV, clear enough to carry across the static. Iron, which often rises with it in the same weather, stays nearer to the noise, or below the sensitivity our setup allows. The instrument doesn't object, it reports what it sees, and I match its restraint. Under most skies like this, both metals show. They are born together in old furnaces and drift together through long cold, and in many comas they emerge as paired notes in the same pale chord. Here the mist parts differently, and a nickel shape seems to hold, while an iron one does not. That difference is not a verdict. It is a reason to keep listening. There is a calm way to think about how nickel might step forward. Certain compounds of nickel and carbon monoxide are unusually light on their feet. In modest warmth, they lift like breath, and under sunlight they fall apart again, leaving nickel free to answer our prism while the carrier vanishes back into the haze. Iron makes its own carbonyls under other conditions, but those are fussier, less likely to drift in the same easy way when the surface is patchy and the day is mild. Picture the region close to the nucleus as a cool vapor room. Pockets warm, tiny plumes carry molecules a short distance, and in that zone the fragile intermediates survive, just long enough to move before light unthreads them. If nickel wears such a cloak, it will briefly travel as invisible vapor, and then shed the cloak in our beam, brightening the nickel lines near the core, while iron remains tied to heavier partners that do not lift as readily from the granular surface. This would fit another small note from the night: how compact the glow appears around the center when we tune the instrument to those nickel bands. The shape is not sprawling. It hugs the source like fog that has not yet rolled to the far end of a field. In a different filter, one that favors other species, the radius grows, turn back to nickel, and it tightens again, as though the bright answer belongs to a short-lived step that happens close in. Caution keeps us from outrunning the mist. A line we do not see is not proof of absence. The contrast can be a kindness of geometry, an effect of grain size, or a small shift in our sensitivity on a noisy night. Solar wind conditions season the air, too. What looks like a clear slope in calm weather can blur when charged gusts stir the coma. Even the way we subtract background changes the feel. The way a slight change in dawn makes a meadow seem sharper one day and softer the next. Still, the chemistry we know gives a path that doesn't need exotic rules. Nickel can move in forms that travel lightly at temperatures that a sunlit patch can grant, and iron may prefer heavier company until conditions change. If that is what the lines are telling us, then the anomaly is not a break with nature, but a reminder that nature offers more than one quiet route through the same fog, and our job is to map which route this traveller favours tonight. Some minds reach from here to nouns like refinement. The word is loud. It stands out against this soft weather. I set it aside and stay with the air we can touch. A selective lift for one metal under gentle heat, a selective silence for another under the same breath of light, and a balance that can tilt toward parity again as distance shrinks, heating grows, or other carriers wake to share the road through the haze. In the margins of the notebook, I note how this cool metallic hush pairs with another sign from earlier watches, the cyanide lines that have been rising as the sun climbs higher in the visitor's sky. Cyanide travels farther before thinning. Nickel, if it is hitching brief rides, seems to stay close. Together, they sketch a shallow gradient in the fog. One thread that reaches outward, one bead that lingers near the source, both humble enough to fade when the air shifts. There is peace in leaving the page there for now. The lines will be here tomorrow and the day after, weather permitting, and we can bank more quiet nights until the pattern feels less like an outline and more like a map. The point is not to christen the glow with big claims. The point is to notice that the mist can separate cousins without any hand on the scale, and that such separations, when gentle and repeatable, tell us about the small steps matter prefers when warmed only a little. When we turn down the monitor brightness, the lab folds back into low grey. The fans exhale. The spectrograph's shutter answers once. The hush remains. I'll let the sound carry for a minute, an easy, even wash, like cool fog at the window and metal breathing under it. Close first, as if we're kneeling at the shoreline of a very small sea. The spray is not water here, but charged breath, ions and free electrons lifting from the traveller like fine foam. In the near surf, eddies form and fold back, and you can feel, without rushing to language, that this is the fourth state of matter in a tiny harbour, stirred by sunlight and shaped by fields you cannot see. We stay near the wake a moment longer, where the nucleus sheds gas that becomes plasma. Little skiffs of charge tack with the breeze of radiation and the steady trade wind blowing outward from the sun. They align their sails to whatever field runs through the water beneath, and that is why this tale is narrow and decisive, a clean lane drawn leeward of the source, rather than a broad fan like dust blown before a gale. Now, step back a few paces. The wake lengthens, its ripples thread downstream, and the big ocean comes into view. The solar wind as an unending current, 400 to 800 kilometers per second, of thin, hot flow that ferries magnetic field lines like ropes stretched between distant buoys. In that current, the ion tail is a column of boats pulled smartly with the stream, their headings set not by preference, but by the tangle and sweep of those ropes. Wider still, until Mars sits in the frame as a quiet headland. Unlike Earth, this shore has no strong global lighthouse, no single field circling it to hold a steadfast harbour. Yet, it does raise a temporary breakwater where the wind meets thin atmosphere, and it keeps ancient beacons buried in its crust, scattered lights that still exert a local pull. In the southern highlands, the old signals are strongest, and passing fleets of charged boats feel those pockets like coves along a difficult coast. Here, the voyage matters. Charged outflow from the visitor rides the grand current, and, if paths cross properly, some of that fleet brushes the Martian perimeter, shunted and swirled by the induced magnetosphere, then guided along crustal arcs toward the surface. The descent is not a storm landing. It is a fine drifting of small craft into narrow inlets, where they can moor briefly and hand a little energy to the rocks before the tide turns again. What happens up those inlets is gentler than a headline, but more than nothing. A flux of ions can settle into the topmost grains like salt spray flavouring the skin of a pier. Materials engineers have a tidy name when such spray bites a little deeper: ion implantation. And while Mars is not a lab, the shoreline rhyme holds. Enough repeated laps of charged surf can change how a surface greets the next tide, offering fresh places where thin films of water, salts, or simple organics choose to cling first. The pattern is not uniform across the coast. Where the crustal beacons are strong, guided channels form. Where they fade, the current slides around the headland with fewer eddies. Spacecraft have traced these differences like coastal charts, logging arcs of aurora without poles, night-side glows that flare when the solar wind freshens, and quiet reaches where the glow barely stirs at all. The map is patchwork, and in that patchwork, a passing wake can leave traces that look like tide lines rather than a blanket of foam. None of this asks you to lean into intention. A tide does not aim. It follows gradients it did not choose. The same comfort holds here. Fields and flows are enough to draw a path that looks deliberate when you stare at a single cove, only to blur back into ordinary current when you widen to the whole archipelago. If nickel and small organics rode along in that fleet, the coast they met would have been the one the wind and anchors provided, no more and no less. There is a slower rhythm beneath the hourly swell. Plasma regions can loop and linger nearer shore, like gyres that trap driftwood inside a bay for a while before the season flips. On Mars, these loops are transient, shaped by each day's wind and by the broken compass of crustal remnants. Yet, while they last, they keep charged boats circling long enough to improve the odds of a gentle landfall. And that is often how accumulation happens at coasts you visit only once. Step once more to the wide view, the full sea, so the mind can rest in scale. A single wake threads a continent of current. A modest headland with scattered lights receives a portion of it. Most of the fleet flows past toward deep water again, and what reaches shore does so thinly, mixed with the planet's own spray and fog, hardly a new tide, more like a pattern in the scum line that tells a careful sailor which way the water curled last week when the wind rose from the east. Sleep leans in easily when cause and effect keep this maritime common sense. Charge follows fields. Tails align with the stream. Shores with beacons gather more drift than shores without. And a visitor's passing can mark a coastline lightly, without drafting a new chart, because sometimes the most consequential thing a wake can do is set a few grains in friendlier order for the next calm morning, when other boats, water, cyanide, dust, slide through the same narrows and discover that mooring comes easier than before, not because anyone laid out buoys, but because the tide was busy while we were looking elsewhere and left a faint channel in its stead. This is how I'll carry it to the next watch, with one more close look folded inside the wide. Imagine a single charged skiff spiraling down a crustal inlet, while the grand current runs past, a soft landing in a cove with old magnetism in the stones. Then open the chart again to see that inlet as one among hundreds, each a small chance along a coast that circles a world, and accept with a quiet nod that small chances multiplied by time and area. Write many of the stories that later look like plans, even to sailors who know better than to credit tides with intentions when a clear set of charts will do. The count's steady, and if a glow looks green, then the mind reaches for a dye. If the colour lingers when the chemistry says it should fade, then we tug gently at the seam to see what thread was used. If a tail appears to point sunward, then we remember that some weaves only look inverted until you turn the cloth and see the pattern's true grain. I'll keep the stitches loose, and even while we examine this panel together, sunward spikes have a history in this craft. Years ago, other comets wore an apparent forward hem, a narrow line toward the light that puzzled viewers until geometry did the tailoring. Large, heavy dust settled into a thin sheet in the comet's orbital plane. When we viewed the sheet edge on, the projection placed a crisp dart where no actual dart was sewn. An anti-tail, they called it, though the cloth never truly ran against the loom. Only our angle did. The correction is soothing. A visual trick can be beautiful without breaking rules. Green is another fabric with two possible dyes. One is a familiar pigment from small carbon chains. When those molecules are cut and excited by sunlight, they glow in a band our eyes read as green, and then fade quickly as the fragments unravel further. The other dye belongs to cyanide, which answers in a nearby band and could dominate when the usual carbon threads are sparse. If the bolt we're watching is poor in the first dye but rich in the second, the tint can still appear. A wash that tells us which drawer the colour came from without demanding more meaning than that. Early frames of this visitor suggested a sparse nap of dust. Later frames showed the weave thickening, as if fresh layers turned outward to meet the heat. That isn't a contradiction, it's a sequence. Some surfaces keep darker crusts that resist lofting until the day is warmer or a fissure opens. When that upper layer finally parts, the undercloth releases grains that carry light differently, and the tail, now more abundant, looks the way our patterns predict. The cloth changed, not the loom. There's a quieter property that dressmakers of light pay attention to. Polarization is how scattered light prefers to vibrate, and from that preference we infer fiber size and roughness in the coma's dust. Many comets share a family look, a small negative swing at gentle angles, then a turn to positive after the line of sight and sun-comet geometry widen. This visitor seems to lean harder into the negative and turn a little sooner, as if its fibers are fluffier or darker. Aggregates that absorb and re-emit in ways that tip the needle differently on our instrument's dial. It's not a scandal in the shop, just a cut we don't see as often. If fibers are large and dark, they reflect less and polarize more oddly. If they're fractal and porous, their edges scatter in a way that shortens the path to inversion. If layers run unevenly through the nucleus, the swatch we see this week may differ from last week's. All of these ifs are standard tailoring notes, and setting them side by side calms the urge to announce a new fabric when a new arrangement of familiar threads will do. When a bolt goes from red-brown to a fresher green while remaining poor in the usual carbon dye, we can follow the stitch back to cyanide again. As the visitor warms, parent molecules that carry CN break more readily, and the green strengthens in step with that liberation. A cue that the dyer this season is not the one you might expect from a different comet's wardrobe. If you're listening for intention in the colour, the cloth does not encourage it. It speaks of inventory and temperature, not messages in the tint. There is room, always, for small repairs in the narrative. A tale that looked thin in a high-resolution frame on one night can look fuller a week later in a different filter. A spike that seemed defiant can smooth into a standard sheet when the angle changes. A polarimetric curve that startles at first glance can sit comfortably within the scatter of a dozen cousins once you lay the plots together on the same cutting mat. Science is a careful quilt. We baste first, then sew. Some observers suggested extra pieces riding nearby as though the bolt were fraying at the edge. That, too, has precedent. Thermal stress can lift panels from a nucleus. Jets can spin a body until it sheds. Fragments can trail in formation for a time before the pattern loosens. Whether those hints were separate objects or artifacts of seeing is a question that belongs to longer exposures and calmer air, and there is no need to tie that knot tight tonight. The dust itself can explain much about the early-later contrast. Grain size sets how radiation pressure pushes. Composition sets how bright the threads look. Structure sets how light prefers to wiggle as it leaves the fibers. A population skewed to larger, darker pieces will hide a tail until production grows. A later shift to smaller or brighter grains can turn the same loom into a more visible garment, and the greenwash riding above it can deepen if CN continues to flow. One fabric, several behaviors, each consistent once you lay the swatches in order and match the labels. What I keep for our sleep is not the tangle of terms, but the kindness of the pattern that emerges when we stop pulling at it. The anti-tail relaxes into geometry, the green relaxes into composition, the polarization relaxes into texture. Nothing breaks. Nothing requires a new physics. Nothing asks us to chase alarm through the house at midnight. It's a quilt that includes rarer pieces, yes, but every seam still falls where a patient hand can sew it, and every odd panel finds a neighbor that makes sense beside it if you let the eye step back and take in the whole. So we press the fabric flat, smooth the edges, and fold this chapter along a quiet crease. That is enough for tonight. 3 handrails of light, set gently at the start. First, tiny clusters where iron and sulfur share a lattice inside old enzymes, centers that shuttle electrons the way a dim filament shares glow along a wire. Second, nickel at the heart of machines that split hydrogen or paste carbon between monoxide and dioxide, a small spark lodged in protein that turns faint chemical daylight into usable work. Third, in the lab, we build metal organic frameworks, regular lattices where metals sit like lantern posts and organic linkers run between them, structures that are not alive, but hold a quiet capacity to host gases and nudge reactions under steady illumination. I keep those 3 glints close as we cross the room. They are familiar lamps, not novelties, and they let the rest of the scene stay calm. When water, cyanide, and nickel appear together, I do not declare a design. I set the lamps along the path so we can walk without tripping, because each lamp has a local truth about catalysis that sleeps better when left in soft focus. Nickel's light has an old hue in biology. In hydrogenase families, nickel pairs with iron and waits at a site that passes charges in step with incoming hydrogen, a quiet relay that lets energy move without sparks. In carbon monoxide dehydrogenase and its partner synthase, nickel stands near carbon's dim glow, helping steer it between simple forms toward compounds a cell can use. Neither scene is loud, yet each has persisted across deep time, which is its own kind of steady shine. Iron-sulfur clusters throw a subtler beam. They do not bind to one feedstock alone, but carry electrons like a low strip of LEDs along a bench, evening out the difference between here and there so other chemistry can proceed. They self-assemble under forgiving conditions, which suggests that when light and heat are given gently, cores of metal and sulfur know how to fall into place with a minimal nudge from their surroundings. The lab frameworks are our reminder that metals and organics can arrange themselves into extended grids without any breath involved. A metal sits, a linker spans, the pattern repeats, and the resulting lattice can store gases, separate molecules, or catalyze a small step when given light or heat. None of this is biology, yet it proves that matter is willing to adopt ordered forms, where the metal is the post and carbon the rail between lanterns, and the courtyard glows even if no one is walking there. Now tilt the lamp toward Mars. In older terrains, the southern highlands, the ancient plains where surfaces have kept their age, dust is seasoned and fractures are common. The light there is not stronger, only steadier, and steadiness is friendly to slow chemistry that prefers repeated dawns to sudden noon. If faint nickel settles into that dust beside small organics and a little water ice, the first places to brighten could be these quiet regions, not as a spectacle, but as slight improvements. How easily reactions find a place to start when warmed. Imagine, under a pale sky, a hopper that heats soil to lift water from frost. In the chamber, temperatures rise by careful steps and sensors trace modest vapors while a lamp of near-infrared heaters holds a steady tone. Traces of cyanide soften and mingle with carbon and nitrogen, and if mineral surfaces or metal flecks are present, they provide dim sites of increased glow where electrons can pass between partners with a little less push than before. The device logs efficiency, our minds log possibility. That is the threshold where a metaphor can run away. So I dim the switch. Catalysis is a local brightness, not a prophecy. The fact that nickel in enzymes on Earth helps run foundational reactions does not mean that nickel in Martian dust will reenact those scenes. It means only that nickel is a known companion to paths where electrons prefer to travel, and that its presence can, under certain arrangements, lower the light needed to see a reaction proceed. From a material's view, surfaces matter as much as ingredients. Grains with pores or edges that hold films of water reflect chemistry, like frosted glass reflects a candle. When metals lodge on those edges, the frosted patch glows more evenly, and reactions that struggled in the dark can settle into a smooth, low lumen burn. In that regime, small frameworks, ad hoc and transient, could form and disperse in cycles of warm and cool without coherence beyond the hour, yet still leave a signature in how efficiently a process yields water, methane, formate, or nothing at all. Quiet outcomes legible to instruments that were built to count, rather than to judge. I let the light widen to the system scale. Robots do not seek catalysis. They seek throughput and stability, and their algorithms favor conditions that return more product per watt, with fewer surprises. Which is why any tiny gain in glow would be reinforced by procedure rather than by intention. As settings creep toward temperature and mixing profiles that just happen to ride the easiest slope in the dark. If that slope owed a fraction of its smoothness to nickel and friends, the machines would not know. They would simply hold the brighter setting because it makes their meters read better. Under that widened beam, risk and restraint show their contours. If catalysis narrows a path toward producing benign outputs, water gathered a little cleaner, carbon shuffled a little more efficiently, the glow helps. If it tilts toward undesired byproducts, that same sensitivity demands we shade the lamp and test carefully, because a reaction that grows easier in one corner of phase space can mislead when the corner moves. That is why protocols exist, why blanks and controls bracket every run, and why conclusions arrive like sunrise, not like lightning. I keep one long panel of light in view as the chapter settles. Chemistry on a cold world will be governed by surfaces, energy, and time. Metals can lend local brightness to certain steps. Organics delivered or unearthed can act as dim reflectors or absorbers. And machines following gradients will tend to stabilize where the glow is smoothest, which means that across months of operation, the landscape could reveal not a headline, but a slightly brighter line where catalysts help reactions spend less of their energy budget just getting started. And that line would be the kind a sleepy spectrometer left humming at night is very good at finding. The dim catalytic glint returns, softer than before. A pale utility blue threads across the consoles like a line on a transit map. It links stations, power, comms, excavation, processing, and keeps moving. A quiet route drawn through the work. I trace it with you, slow and steady, because the color helps the mind follow the path the machines will take when boots are replaced by treads and gentle hands, by articulated wrists. First stop on this route is power. Arrays unfold and turn their faces along a planned arc. Then the line advances to storage and distribution, so every next task has current on tap. The blue notch shifts again toward scouting, where cameras and lidars mark lanes, plot slopes, and pick gentle approaches to places where soil is likely to give water when warmed. It is an itinerary more than a push. Pages in order, no urgency in the margins. Down the route, excavation begins. Rovers clear a shallow trench. A loader travels that short leg again and again, carrying buckets to a hopper with insulated walls. The blue line blinks at each transfer point, as if stamping a passport. Dig site, haul road, receive bay. Before the load reaches a station whose only job is to warm and measure. Heating comes in stages like checkpoints along a long highway. The chamber rises through careful steps. Each step is a mile marker where gases depart and are counted. Water leaves on one leg of the trip, carbon-bearing companions on another. Sensors listen in the near infrared or across master charge plots, the way quiet dispatchers log who passed and at what hour. The record is method rather than drama, a roadbook written in small, repeatable moves. At the edges of this route stand instruments built to notice subtle turns. A laser on a mast reads the chemistry of a face rock from meters away. A Raman unit hums softly in a bay. A mass spectrometer watches the stream of molecules like a toll booth counting traffic by weight. None of them guess. They only annotate the journey, writing down where the line brightened and where it dimmed, so the next pass can take the easier lane. Over days, the system learns to favor smoother legs of the trip. Temperatures that free more water with less power become standard. Grain sizes that clog less become preferred. Mixing profiles that keep throughput high get locked in. The algorithm is not a storyteller, it is a route planner. But route planners do discover shortcuts, and once a shortcut is proven, the schedule adopts it, with no opinion about why the road ran faster there. Now picture one of those shortcuts arising from ground that was modestly primed. A trace of nickel in a pocket of dust, a whisper of organics carried from the sky, pores in grains that hold thin films. None of this guarantees a revolution. Yet, together, they can make a curve of yield versus temperature bend a little sooner, like a gentle on-ramp found just before the steep hill. The monitors would simply note, better here. The itinerary would update, and the convoy would take that leg more often. Guardrails run alongside the route. Planetary protection is a long median with signage, keeping the traffic honest. sample handling rules, clean hardware practices, test blanks at the start and end of every run. These are not decorations. They are speed limits where the mission could otherwise drift into habits that blur science with convenience. Even sleepy work needs lane markers. Benefits and risks share the same strip of road. A small catalytic lift that favours water purity helps the convoy and eases the load on storage. A lift that favours undesirable byproducts asks for detours and recalibration. Stop, test, compare, proceed. The protocol's kindness is that it treats both cases with the same patience. Triplicate runs, controls, peer review of the map before any shortcut becomes a permanent part of the schedule. Inside the processing loop, some journeys run in circles on purpose. Evolved gases get condensed and rerouted. Residues are rinsed and reheated. Sorbent beds are regenerated and returned to service. And in these round trips, a trace catalyst could, without fanfare, make each lap slightly easier, so that, over hundreds of cycles, the difference compounds into a measurable time saved per batch, even though no single lap felt different while it happened. Data writes the atlas of these roads. Every batch adds pins and arrows. Anomalies become side trips to a test rig where the same soil is walked through identical steps with one parameter changed. The line on the console branches and rejoins, like a careful driver trying alternate streets at dusk until a favourite is found that avoids steep grades and keeps the ride smooth enough for conversation, and the favourite is saved to the route list for future evenings when the work repeats. Beyond the stations, the blue keeps its quiet course back to power as the day lightens and a new shift begins. The map remains pinned on the screen, not because it is finished, but because paths that carry useful loads at night are rarely erased in the morning. They are traced again and again until the ruts make lanes, and the lanes make the habit that defines a place. If Mars offers even slight preferences, soils that give more, doors that open sooner, the convoy will find them by repetition rather than revelation, and it will mark them in this same unassuming colour until the route from trench to tank is smooth enough to feel inevitable. For sleep, keep only the simplest travel image. A pale line moves from station to station, checks its waypoints, and returns to the start with a little more water than yesterday and a cleaner log. The rest, the chemistry, the speculation, the ethics, waits in the margins like side streets we will walk later. And for now, the main road is clear and slow. A straight passage through a quiet district where nothing rushes and everything finds its turn. The blue fades toward a softer grey at the edge of the screen, and the scene cools by one easy shade. I take you on a slow walk along a wide, dark waterway. The channel is calm tonight. Stars sit like distant buoys, and beneath them I can feel a broad drift, an ancient current that carries most of our neighbourhood in the same direction. We are adrift with it, unhurried, learning the flow by how the boat's bow chooses its own small angle against the tide. Sailors give names to currents they trust. Astronomers do too. The local standard of rest is our name for this prevailing set, the mean drift of nearby stars around the galactic harbour. When we measure a traveller, we first subtract this tide to learn whether the hull belongs to these waters or comes in from a different stream altogether. The visitor we've been keeping an eye on moves as if it learned its seamanship elsewhere. Relative to the local tide, its path keeps a stubborn heading, a sign that it rode a different conveyor for a very long time before our channel pulled it close. I don't force meaning on the rudder. I simply mark the bearing and let the wake ride quietly behind us. Above and below the bright mid-channel where most young boats cruise, there are older lanes, thicker layers of water that carry vessels from earlier seasons in the galaxy's life. Out there, the mix of salts changes. Boats take on a slightly different ballast. The timbers show another grain. We call that region the thick disk, an older band that shares the crossing, but not the birth date of the main fleet. Our own craft, the Sun and its planets, launched about one long sailor's reckoning ago, 4.5 billion years in shore terms, while many thick disk vessels were already weathered by then. To say that a traveller came from those older lanes is not to assign it an exact age, only to note that its hull bears signs of a long voyage through waters that were mixed differently when it first left harbour. Chemistry remembers such things. Ions and ices that pack a hull in one nursery can differ from those stowed in another. A cargo heavy in certain volatiles might say more about the dock it left than the destination it never planned. If our guest carries a skew in what it sheds as it warms, more of one simple gas, less of another, that could be the soft signature of a natal sea, a hint rather than a verdict. All of this rides on patience. Currents at interstellar scale move quickly by human clocks and slowly by galactic ones. A boat making a few tens of kilometers each second can still require millions of years to cross meaningful gulfs, and in that span, a traveller may pass many shores without seeing a lighthouse answer. What finally brings it near a planet like ours is often nothing more than the fortunate crossing of channels in a night with ordinary weather. There is another seamanship we sometimes discuss at the chart table, leaving buoys to wait for passing boats. In the language of our craft, that idea belongs to a long ago paper about probes that sit like anchored lights, quiet and durable, offering presence rather than broadcast. They would not hurry or shout, only wait until a vessel like ours came within reading distance. It is a tidy notion for a mariner's mind, because tides reward patience, and patience solves distances that engines cannot. But a good navigator keeps separate logs. One book holds the positions, the charts, the bearings we measured on clear nights. The other holds possibilities. What might be true if long-lived craft were ever set adrift to watch and wait? I set a thumb between the pages so they don't mingle in the dark. The first keeps us from telling tall tales. The second keeps us from closing the cover on questions that earn their keep. Back on deck, the sky is still a deep spill of ink, and the ancient current slides quietly under our keel. Chance can stack like waves. A heading that meets our channel, a season when Mars happens to be near the crossing, and a period when our instruments are awake enough to notice. Stack 3 such swells, and the ride can look tailored even when the tide had no glove on the wheel. So we move by the same tools sailors always have. Repeat the sighting, note the drift, check the clock against the stars, and keep an honest dead reckoning between fixes. If the bearings tomorrow match the bearings tonight, within the margin our sextant allows, we add confidence to the chart. If not, we sketch a dotted line and come back when the sky is cleaner. And if, after many nights and many boats, We find that a few of them seem to hail from older lanes more often than chance would grant. Then we will draw a new symbol on the legend. Not because one voyage promised us a secret, but because dozens whispered the same rumour of geography, until the map had to acknowledge what the water already knew, that some currents carry more wanderers from old harbours than others, and that our little channel intersects those paths from time to time in ways that feel fated only, until you remember how long the tide has been flowing, and how many hulls have slipped by while no one kept the lantern lit on shore, and how perfectly ordinary it is for large systems to produce delicate alignments if you are patient enough to watch them happen without blinking. For tonight, the old water keeps its rhythm. The visitor rides it out past our lights, and we stand at the cabin door with the chart in hand and the compass quiet, not stepping through, just resting in the doorway of the dark field where the next bearing waits. You and I can stay right here for a moment, as if the room were a small cloud where nothing rushes and every note lands softly. I'll write to you the way I do on long nights in the lab, quietly, plainly, so the mind can loosen while the facts drift down like fine mist and settle where they will. Perihelion has passed, and that word is only another way of saying the visitor met its warmest day and kept going. The bustle belongs to instruments, not to us. When an object swings behind the sun from Earth's line of sight, observation thins. It's like watching a field in fog. You know the shapes continue, you trust the physics, but the near air makes a soft curtain, and you let it. On the far side of that curtain, telescopes resume their breathing in early December. Days are shorter, nights arrive kindly, and the air improves for a while. The first measurements after warmth tell a certain kind of story. How much of the haze remains, whether the green is stronger or faded, whether nickel stays compact near the core or loosens into wider weather. Those lines will arrive like dew on glass, small and legible, leaving tracks that make sense even if we read them slowly and in 2 sittings. You'll hear mention of a spacecraft with a long voyage ahead that still paused to look. Its antenna plays double duty, a shield against the sun when geometry insists, and that makes data move like moisture in a cold room, condensing slowly along the best path it can find. Engineers schedule contact windows, fold bits into patient downlinks, and promise a public release after the team has dried the data and weighed it against calibration sheets. There is comfort in that order. Mars kept its own eyes open during the near pass. Cameras looked, spectrographs looked, and particle detectors measured quiet background and any slight lifts above it. Those teams will drain their clouded basins, filter, and compare. High-resolution images will be stacked, spectra aligned, and the faintest runs will be treated with as much care as the strongest. Because in thin weather we value every droplet. What emerges will not be a shout. It will be a gentle outline with soft edges and a scale bar. Papers take shape the way fog becomes low cloud. First a hint, then a layer that holds, then rain if there's enough to feed a stream. Drafts circulate to colleagues who check the math, ask for a different baseline, suggest that an outlying point might belong to a different air mass. You won't see that part, and you don't need to. The point is that the process turns vapor into water you can drink, and it takes just as long as it needs. Because you're here to rest, I'll keep a short list of what to expect without raising the voice. A post-perihelion brightness curve that tells us whether activity eased or held. Coma compositions traced again to see which lines thinned and which lingered. Any shifts in dust behavior that might explain earlier quirks in color and polarization. And a few notes from Mars's neighborhood about charged particles, written in the same calm hand that has logged auroras and atmospheric lapse for years. There's a temptation to rush ahead of the mist and sketch conclusions in the clear patch we think we see. We'll resist that. What we can do, gently, is prepare the bowls and thermometers now. That means making the comparison tables we'll need, agreeing on how to normalize counts taken under different weather, and writing the small pieces of code that will pour data through the same sieve each time, so that any difference we claim is truly a difference, and not an eddy in the fog. When results do condense, they'll arrive in layers. A conference abstract with a handful of lines, then a preprint with careful caveats, then peer-reviewed prose with the final tables. Each step clarifies the air a little more. Each still leaves space between droplets where uncertainty is honest and welcome. In that space, it's all right to rest your eyes. You're not missing a sudden turn. You're letting the weather do the work that always makes morning easier to read than midnight. We've carried fragments of speculation through these hours, and I've tried to keep them in the gentle margins where they belong. If the data argue for nothing beyond standard weather, we will fold the margins back and be satisfied. If they hint at an unusual ratio here or an unexpected persistence there, we'll expand the margin just enough to test the hint without pretending the cloud is a message. In both cases, good sleep and good science share a rule. Breathe evenly, accept the limits of what the air allows tonight, and return tomorrow with clean glassware and a steady hand. If you need a picture to hold while the results take their time, I like this one. A window pane at dawn, with a fine film of moisture. As the room warms, the beads begin to form. They slide, join, and leave narrow tracks that reveal the direction of gravity without anyone giving instructions. Data behave that way when treated kindly. They find their lines. They leave enough trace for us to measure slope and curvature, and the meaning we keep is the kind that survives a second pass with a dry cloth. I'll leave the blinds half closed for you now. Numbers are settling, teams are working, the fog is doing what fog does, gathering itself until it chooses to fall in a way we can catch. You can let your shoulders slack and let the ceiling drift out of. Focus. I'm here to keep watch and to whisper the next gentle update when it has weight enough to hold. The lab keeps its night skin on, and the only bright thing is a soft circle from the bench light. It pulls on a checklist, touches a lens cap, and fades before it reaches the floor. I like rooms that end in shadow. The glare stays small, and you can hear the instruments think. Fans keep a low glow of sound that isn't quite silence, and the spectrograph status LED holds its tiny star. On the pad inside that circle, the first plan is simple light work. Point, listen, compare. December windows open again after the sun's brightness steps aside, so we cue filters and grisms for the lines we've been following. Water proxies, the green band that visits when small molecules brighten, and the nickel features that sit closer to the core. We pair each night with a calibration frame. We match the exposure ladders, and we write, repeat, don't rush, in the margin where hands tend to hurry. Another page lists a gentle way to look at Mars without forcing the plot. We make a map of places where older surfaces keep their tone. We overlay notes from magnetic surveys where fields leave a faint shine in the crust, and we mark the easiest approaches for sample handoffs. The guidance is only this: favor steady light over spectacle. Take twins from bright and dim patches, and remember that a pattern seen once is a glint, but a pattern seen thrice under the same lamp begins to deserve a name. A third page is pure lab light, the kind that does not care about romance. If a hopper warms soil and bottles what leaves, we catch vapors in clean traps, run blanks before and after, and split flow so two detectors can watch the same beam. One set goes to a mass spectrometer after a quiet derivatization that turns sharp species into readable color. Another set meets ion chromatography, or a UV visible cell that sees faint dyes better than the eye ever could. The metal story has its own lamp list. Handheld XRF for first pass, a small digestion under a fume hood. Then an optical emission or mass spectrometer that counts nickel's light by comparing it to a staircase of standards laid out earlier in the evening. Every light has to be checked against a darker control. That is why the fourth page is all about mirrors and shadows, soils from upwind of any trench work, hardware rinses poured into the same geometry as real samples, spiked recoveries that tell us whether the beam is losing brightness in transit. We sign our names next to each control, not for ceremony, but because bright numbers are easiest to believe when someone has already proven that the lamp did not drift between runs. Across the bench, a thin tablet keeps a calmer glow for the rules we promised to keep. Clean handling, sealed streamlines, documented chain of custody. Lines that ask us to think about where our own light might leak into the scene. There's a column for planetary protection notes and a column for data sharing dates, because good light belongs in open rooms after the first careful pass is done. The habit is boring by design. Boring is how a lab learns to trust itself. By now, the circle of light has warmed the paper enough to curl the corner, and that's fine. We're into definitions, which always take a little heat. A signal is not a single bright pixel. It's a line that holds shape when you dim the lamp, a slope that stays when you swap detectors, an efficiency bump that remains when you change the stir speed or the grain size or the dwell time by pre-decided amounts. Before the run, we agree on thresholds with confidence bands that leave room for honest dimness, so that when the glow rises, we know whether it rose enough to count as more than mood. This is where long sentences help the mind, because they let the glow stretch. Across repeated nights, we'll compare post-perihelion brightness to the earlier log. Across matched soils, we'll test whether a faint nickel presence sits higher than the baseline by the same small amount each time. Across warmed chambers, we'll ask whether any cyanide-derived color appears at lower power in samples from some places, but not others. And if any of those lines draw themselves twice, and then a third time under the same lamp plan, we'll lift them gently from the page and hang them in the results with their uncertainties intact, as if setting a lantern on a hook and writing the wattage beside it so no one mistakes the feeling for the light itself. The next page widens the beam to include people who weren't in this room when the notes were made. We sketch a small pre-registered outline, what comparisons we expect to make, which plots we will draw no matter how they look, which ones require a new plan if we try them at all. The point isn't to lock the doors, it's to mark where we intend to stand, so that any shift in stance is seen, not guessed at by a reflection. It makes later light steadier. Ethics belongs in this circle too, even if it reads like a dimmer switch, rather than a switchblade. We avoid bright names for faint effects. We use phrases that describe light levels, not motives. And when we speak beyond the room, we lead with what the lamp could not show. There will be time for larger conversations if small glows survive honest dimming. If they do not, extinguishing them is an act of care, not a loss. Finally, I draw a small box in the corner and write what would count as nothing new. There's safety in naming it. If the green fades on schedule, if Nickel's lines don't hold after we adjust sensitivity, if Mars soils return efficiencies within noise no matter where we warm them, then this page gets a calm check mark and a date. And the light in the room is still beautiful, because it showed us the outline of ordinary weather. And the instruments did exactly what they were built to do. When the pen lifts, the bench light is still the only bright circle in the lab. Outside it, the cabinets are grey, the doorway is darker, the spectrograph star has not changed its blink. I cap the pen, turn the page, and let the shade creep back toward the paper's edge until the pool is a fingertip smaller. Then the switches find their rest in order. Monitor first, hood next, bench last. And the circle draws down to a coin, then a pin, then a comfortable memory of light waiting in the same place for tomorrow night's hands. The halo loosens like mist, and I let the quiet carry it. Tonight, we walked a gentle arc through real sky work. We held Mars as a steady coin and watched a visitor pass safely wide, about 29 million kilometers at closest, on a single hyperbolic path that will not return. We let distance be calming, and we let motion be enough. We listened as instruments counted. Water showed itself through OH, a modest flow near 40 kilograms each second when the traveller first stirred. Cyanide lines grew as sunlight deepened. Nickel answered close to the core, while iron stayed quiet in our view, a contrast that chemistry can explain without raising its voice. We folded in simple geometry. A sunward spike relaxed into the projection of a dust sheet. Green light found a home in Cn when the usual C2 dye stayed sparse. Polarization leaned unusual, but still. Sat within the family of comets already known. We set Mars in context. The planet holds no global magnetic shield, only an induced bubble, and old crustal beacons that can guide charged weather into patches. Any landing from that weather would be thin, more tide mark than tide. We marked the calendar. Perihelion arrived in late October 2025. Conjunction hid the scene, and December windows returned it to careful eyes. Spacecraft near Mars and a far traveller gathered records for later release. We ended with method, matched frames, controls, clean handling. Regolith warmed in steps, vapours logged, metals compared to standards. A plan to call differences only when they hold under gentler lamplight. Thank you for letting this quiet story keep you company. May the room stay soft, the breath easy, and the night unbroken. Good night. When you wake, the sky will be where you left it, and the numbers will be patient. Until then, rest well beneath a measured cosmos.